Hello and welcome again to our IC4ML video conversation series, where we are probing some foundational, fundamental assumptions and definitions and locations and contextualizations of media literacy. This is a kind of a theoretical effort, and we hope that this is what will help us determine what the direction should be for media literacy praxis. And we're joined time and again by experts who spent a lifetime in the field. And today's guest is Barbara Ruth Burke. She will be talking to me about something very intriguing about the conditions for media literacy. So Barbara is an associate professor of communication, media, and rhetoric at the University of Minnesota in Morris. She holds basically two masters. One is in American Studies and one in telecommunication arts. And she also holds a PhD in American Studies from Purdue. She's interested in exploring media messages, understanding identity, and the ways that culture is shaped by mediated interpersonal communication. So a perfect blend to talk about the conditions for media literacy. Barbara has held a faculty Fulbright teaching and research fellowship to explore media literacy in Latvia. And I think that is an important feature that Barbara would bring to the table in terms of the context and international conditions that we might seek in media literacy. So welcome, Barbara.
Hi, I want to thank you for allowing me to join this conversation. And I do want to say that I've been so impressed with the other parts in this video series. So there may be moments when I hearken back to those, but I encourage those listening to me to also explore what else is out there.
I'm happy.
Please let me start by, pardon me?
Yeah, I'm happy you could join us. So let me toss the question to you, which is, what are the conditions for media literacy, Barbara? I mean, and just we've discussed this before, but just for the viewer, we're really talking about conditions in modernity, right? Like we are talking about the institutions of modernity. What are the economic, political, cultural, social conditions, even moral conditions? We live in a global village. We presume that we like democracy. I know you've done some work on Trump, so that might be almost ironic there. Contextual, linguistic, community. How do communities benefit, for example, from media literacy? We're starting to explore that as well. So is that a condition? And morality. I mean, is media literacy amoral? Is it like aesthetics, or is it more like a social contract that the media have a social contract that media literacy is trying to unearth, or is it something else? So the conditions for media literacy are so diverse that I can't capture everything, and I'm sure you will capture a strand of it in the few minutes that we get to do this. So without further ado, let me toss that question to you, Barbara. What are the conditions for media literacy?
Well, my first impulse is to say, yes, everything you just mentioned is a component element. But of course, not talking about everything is essential because we have limited time. And I'm really thinking about media literacy from a kind of critical cultural perspective, in which I'm thinking about the constraints which take place and the affordances that come with certain types of media forms. My early interest in media literacy came from my enthusiasm as a consumer of television products. I really liked watching television when I was young. I liked talking about it with my friends. I liked analyzing it and arguing about it. And then as a college student, I became a student who learned about media production. working in media industries for a short period of time in television, in print, and in radio, I started seeing behind the scenes, so to speak, how things were made, the constraints of an industry and a structure and an organization that had hierarchy. And so the beginning of my exploration in media literacy was becoming aware of limitations that took place in what one might consider late 20th century mainstream dominant media forms, things that were created for a large audience, a heterogeneous public, and these were items created by institutions that had invested in a set of expensive equipment and a training process and a hierarchy of decision makers. So I had this very foundation being a traditional media consumer, a traditional media maker of a certain era. And my awareness grew when I started realizing I could ask questions like, not only what is being shown or represented, but what is being omitted? And asking questions like, whose interests are being served by this particular piece of media? And those are questions that really were at the forefront of cultural studies in 1980s, 1990s, media studies to a large extent. Those questions are still relevant today, even though our media landscape is much more diverse. And our media landscape allows for a lot more types of media creators of all kinds of education levels, all kinds of racial categories, all kinds of identities, and all kinds of geographic locations. But we come back to certain things like questions about whose interests are being served by what we are receiving as messages, what political, social, economic, and power structures are reinforced, and what kinds of opportunities are limited. Because, as you mentioned, this enthusiasm for democracy is beneath the surface, and democracy depends on lots of conditions, such as an informed public being able to understand the issues of the day, having adequate information, and having the opportunity to discuss within a public sphere their opinions in a way which is open to dialogue for decision making. Now, those are all wonderful things to say, but then we come to the reality of the 21st century, where we have all kinds of social media, micro broadcasting, point-to-point mediated communication that could potentially not go to a broad audience, but to a narrow or focused audience. So the conditions that I am most interested in are technological, structural, cultural, and other forms of identity-based, and strangely, maybe political. And I feel like I need to unpack those and clarify them for the purposes of talking about media literacy.
Right.
My enthusiasm about media literacy is not that it's a skill one learns in primary or elementary school, checks off the box, and is done with it, but rather that media literacy is a lifelong process of learning, and it's a continual renewal of questioning sensibility one has about the world they live in. So with that in mind, although I thought I really understood television, as I move forward, I'm beginning to really ask the same questions of social media. My research currently deals with how people make decisions about when to speak up and when to remain silent in social media. I also do a lot of research on educational media, especially related to the Zoom interface and Skype lessons and Google Meet and chat, this notion of the technological separation between people. And if that encourages freedom of speech or freedom of expression, or if that technological intervention creates inhibiting or silencing types of ways of thinking as we fashion a limited type of communication. For instance, here you see me, but only part of me in only one room. As I reassure my students in classes, as I reassure my colleague in video conferences, we're media literate in that we form certain types of performative appearances, we carefully craft messages, we think about media literacy, but we don't do it quite as systematically as I would like to have future scholars, thinkers, and students perform media literacy. So we have some educational constraints. How do you know you're doing it when you're doing it? How do you know what it really is? And I think that there is great enthusiasm for breaking down boundaries, expanding opportunities, and people care about media literacy deeply. When I run discussions and focus groups in my research, when I send out surveys, when I analyze groups on social media, there's this real enthusiasm for trying to understand this world we live in, which is completely mediated. Well, right now, almost completely mediated as we move post-COVID. Maybe there'll be a day of face-to-face communication again, but we're living in this media-rich environment, this media environment where everywhere there's media, and it's an obligation for citizens and for people of the world to think about what, when, who, and where they're talking through media. And so that's where I come to media literacy. I also kind of jump in thinking about some of the arguments Fisk had with television. Now, John Fisk wrote about television, but he talked about culture, and he talked about ways in which the traditional media of the late 20th century was reinforcing and restating and replicating the structures and rules of the dominant class, of the dominant, powerful media industries. So for media literacy in the 21st century, what are those structures? That comes back to the question that you brought to me at the beginning of this interaction. We have to be examining the constraints. We have to be examining and articulating and thinking very clearly about reality, representation, and ideology, just as Fisk did with television with newer media forms.
What do you think is the end game then of media literacy? Is it to create that kind of awareness, or is it resistance? Because you raised the structural condition in which media literacy exists today, because media literacy needs to kind of almost swim against the tide, because the media themselves are situated in the same structures. That's why
I'm sorry. I think awareness is a precondition for resistance. I think that in many instances, the lack of scrutiny of the daily, everyday experience is what leads people to not realize that they are being limited. I'm not saying oppressed, but limited, certainly. We become limited by the things we think of as everyday and natural and normal. We can go into the language of hegemony if one wishes, but until we're aware, we can't take action to make a better world. And I think that there's a real importance in inclusiveness and the value of creativity and applying and integrating. I've spent most of my professional faculty career at a university that focuses on liberal arts, that emphasizes and celebrates the breadth of knowledge which is necessary for understanding the world we live in, and really thinks in a way that celebrates interdisciplinarity. And I believe that we need to point out the importance of such things as scholars to help a public at large take action. We shouldn't be sitting just talking to ourselves, although we are right now, but we should be talking to and making possibilities for people to reach their fullest potential. And I think media literacy is a set of ideas and skills that lead people toward that outcome.
It's very interesting. You linked technology with kind of artifice that pretends to be natural almost, and that condition um, is almost ripe for media literacy to explore, where the media literate person recognizes the invisible, so to speak, or the artifice beneath the naturalness. We've got to leave it there, unfortunately, Barbara, because we've run out of time. Not that we've run out of ideas, because you were weaving this toward the idea that awareness is a precondition for media literacy. I think that's a great takeaway from this conversation that we've had. So I'd like to thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.